Everyone.
Welcome to Prescribed Fire, a land restoration tool that we're lucky to have. See what we did there? Happy St. Patrick's Day. My name is Kate Williamson, and I'm the Director of Conservation here at the Natural Resources Foundation of Wisconsin. We're really thrilled that you're joining us today and very excited to have our good friend and partner, Jeb Barzen, joining us as an expert from the Wisconsin Prescribed Fire Council to talk more about the critical role of fire on our landscapes and kind of efforts to get more on the ground. So before we get started, I'd like to just start us off with a little bit of overview of the Natural Resources Foundation of Wisconsin for those of you who might not be familiar with us as an organization. So we were established back in 1986, and we are a statewide nonprofit. We work to protect our state's lands and waters and wildlife, and we do that by providing funding, leading partnerships, and connecting all people with nature in Wisconsin. Some of the ways that we work, as a funder, we grant out over $1 million each year to on-the-ground conservation and environmental education projects and programs all across the state. We also run signature outreach programs to connect people to nature, including our popular field trip program and our Great Wisconsin Birdathon that I'll share more about in a moment. We also really work to, work closely with our conservation partners across the state to really advance uh, wildlife and lands and waters conservation, really with a focus on our most ecologically important yet imperiled landscapes and species. So we're up to a lot of great work, and we'd love to have you join us as a member. You can do that by visiting us at wisconservation.org. I'm also excited to share that this is our 40th anniversary year. If you did the math, when I said we were established in 1986, we're very excited to be hosting a number of events, of which this is kind of one of the first ones on the calendar today. But we have a couple of other webinars coming up later this year, including one in April on trumpeter swans, one of our flagship projects and a really inspiring conservation project, one on dark skies later this year. And then we're thrilled that we've been partnering with PBS Wisconsin to develop a full-length documentary style film on conservation here in the state of Wisconsin. And we'll be doing a couple of sneak peek events for that film in October, so stay tuned for that. You can learn more and sign up for these various events and shop our fun 40th merch at wisconservation.org/. 40th-anniversary. As I mentioned, our field trip program is one of our popular programs that we have here at NRF. And our registration is opening pretty soon here on April 8th. For those of you who are already members, you probably received your guidebook in the mail this past weekend or will be soon. I know I got mine, and it's always so fun to look through. So if you're not familiar, this trip program is amazing. It's for adults and families. We have this year more than 275 trips all over the state, led by different conservation experts across many, many different topics. Here I've highlighted a number of both fire-related trips and also just some newer trips we have. One highlight is in May, we actually have our first multi-day field trip. So if you think that might be for you, it's a Northwoods birding weekend, which should be a lot of fun. We have several related to prescribed fire and fire impacts on restoration and particular natural communities. Um, and those are really incredible trips that we're excited to be offering. And have a new beaver paddle trip if you want to learn more about beavers. This one's for you. Um, as I mentioned, registration is opening on April 8th at noon. And this trip program is for members. If you're not already a member, please go ahead and sign up. You can learn more about that on our website. We also have Great Wisconsin Birdathon coming up. The Birdathon is an amazing event. It's the largest fundraiser for bird conservation here in the state and runs from any day between April 15th and June 15th. And registration just opened. So now's a great time to sign up your team. You can gather your friends or family members, coworkers, neighborhood folks, any group of people can go out and participate and join a team. The event, again, gets people outside looking for birds. You try to find as many species as you can within a 1 day period. And the funds raised go to all manner of really high priority bird conservation projects, from habitat work here in Wisconsin all the way to our, Wisconsin birds where they overwinter in Central and South America, monitoring bird populations, doing a lot of specific work on or work specific to threatened and endangered species that we have here in the state, such as Kirtland's warblers and piping plovers, whooping cranes, and inspiring the next generation of bird conservationists. So it's a really incredible program. It's a lot of fun. I know I'm looking forward to getting my team together again this spring. You can visit wibirdathon.org to learn more. And just to touch on some of the ways that the Natural Resources Foundation supports prescribed fire as a critical land management tool, before we dive into our presentation for today. Since we were established, fire has been, again, a critical aspect of restoration and management that we've supported through grants, largely to our partners, whether that be at the Department of Natural Resources, or to many other nonprofits and land trusts and other groups across the state to bring this important tool to the properties that they manage. So as a foundation, we really focused a lot of our efforts on state natural areas and the SNA program, which really safeguards our, most intact and special and remaining natural communities in the state. So I love this picture here from one of the Southwest Grassland properties and fire that was there a number of years ago, uh, made possible thanks to some funding through the Natural Resources Foundation. And so this is something that we annually support across the state on state natural areas, but a number of other types of public lands as well. The Cherish Wisconsin Outdoors Fund, if you're not familiar, is a way that one of the ways that we support this. It's a fund that supports public lands management, and it's funded really neatly. It's funded by folks when they're buying their hunting or fishing license can choose to donate voluntarily to this fund. And this all goes into the Cherish Fund and is used to support a variety of projects to care for our public lands, including prescribed fire. We also have a number of competitive grant programs, including our C.D. Bazadny Conservation Fund, which has supported various prescribed fire projects across the state with different partners, including land trusts and other conservation groups who hold land. As I mentioned before, our field trip program is increasingly offering trips that educate the public about prescribed fire and what are the impacts and how's it done safely and that sort of thing. So it's a really great opportunity we're proud to be supporting here. And most recently, we're thrilled to be providing some capacity building funding to the Wisconsin Prescribed Fire Council to support their incredible work to really advance bringing more prescribed fire to the landscape here in Wisconsin in a safe and impactful way. And as you'll hear from Jeb in a moment, there's just a tremendous need to bring more fire to the landscape and have that impact that we want to see in the landscape to care for our natural communities. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce Jeb Barzen, who's the chair of the Wisconsin Prescribed Fire Council. Again, Jeb is a longtime friend and partner of NRF in various capacities, and he just brings tremendous experience both here in North America and in Asia, and over 40 years of a career with working with private landowners and institutions to really implement and advance ecological restoration, increasingly, with a focus on prescribed fire. So Jeb just has so much, a wealth of knowledge that I'm thrilled to have him here to speak with you all today on prescribed fire here in Wisconsin. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jeb.
Well, good. Thank you very much, Caitlin. Let me see. I'm always challenged to multitask. Let me get my slides up here. Okay. So it is great to be here. I am particularly honored to help the Natural Resources Foundation of Wisconsin celebrate their 40th year since I've been indirectly involved with the foundation since I've been in Wisconsin, which is for 38 years. And I'm fortunate to be married to my wife, who is been involved with a foundation, and it's actually had a collaborated with starting the field trip program and the birdathon and lots of other things with the Natural Resources Foundation. So it's indeed an honor to be here. And I get to talk about something that I'm quite passionate about, which is prescribed fire. And this series of pictures, if you look, um, basically, if we start in the upper right-hand corner with what a Barrens landscape looks like, Barrens is a type of ecological community that is sort of a savanna that's located on sands or is particularly dry. And that same savanna in the lower right-hand corner this is what it looks like immediately after a prescribed burn. And it might not look pretty in terms of it's smoky and black and it looks like great harm has been done. But the thing that's always fascinating is in the lower left-hand corner, this is what it looks like just a few months later. And what's particularly interesting is that this landscape, this is a Barrens from Rattlesnake Ridge in northern Iowa County. And this landscape, when we started doing restoration work on it 30 years ago, a little bit more than 30 years ago now, we didn't even know that lupin, that blue flower that's dramatically abundant in that area, we didn't even know that lupin was there. And so after our first prescribed burn, we found a few lupin, and since then the lupins have multiplied dramatically, not just with fire alone, but with all kinds of restoration activities that were there. But the fires forms the basis of that. And so I want to try and speak with you today briefly about the why fire point of view, not so much how we go about burning. That's a subject for another day. Perhaps it's something that we can do with NRF in the future if you folks are interested enough. Um, but I really want to focus on why burn for most of the talk today. So we'll venture into that. Um, in a previous life, I worked at the International Crane Foundation for a long period of time, but this picture to me kind of encapsulates prescribed fire in that it is planned, it is safe, it is effective, and it is efficient. So it's planned in that obviously with these nice straight lines and with where we're serious about crane propagation, Crane City in the upper part of the photo, it's really clear that we darn well better plan that so that smoke doesn't go towards our captive crane population, so that the fire doesn't escape and is a problem. But we're doing it also because we're reestablishing prairie ecosystems, which in part serve as crane habitats for most of the 15 species of cranes in the world. And it's a really efficient way of doing management on those particular properties. And this picture sort of encapsulates all of that, and that we can be actually precise enough to have no burned areas, as you can see in my cursor, and also burn tiny little areas, as you see over here, as well as larger areas that you see in the right. And so this, I really kind of like this picture because it talks about what prescribed fire really is. And the fact that the Crane Foundation lets me light or had let me light fires on their property when I was an employee is pretty much a cool thing. Conversely, fire suppression is almost the opposite of every one of those things. It is not planned in that we don't know when a wildfire is going to occur. It is very much a dangerous affair to be involved with. It is very ineffective at promoting conservation, and it can be ineffective, or how do I say the opposite of efficient? It's very inefficient in terms of the amount of money that it costs to deal with that. In other words, it's much less expensive to do prescribed burns on a area than to put out these massive wildfires that cause a great deal of environmental damage. And so even though this is actually a fire students that we're in the midst of training, but it is in this particular case how to put out that prescribed fire or how to put out um, a simulated wildfire that's occurring here, and that there's nothing controlling this fire, there's no fire break, and so on. And it's up to these people to be putting that out. And we're, of course, teaching them how to do that in a safe manner. But you get the idea that wildfire is pretty much the antithesis of prescribed fire in almost all cases. So if you move into why we're interested in fire, um, if I had to have just one slide to depict this, this is the slide obviously that I would choose. So in this landscape from 1870, here is the Wollersheim Winery, which is located just east of Prairie du Sac, Wisconsin. Many of you perhaps have been there. And in this picture, the white arrow depicts the Wollersheim Winery over basically almost 130 years, 127 if I get my math correct. Um, but in that, you can see the winery as seeing that I'm showing you the same landscape over this greater than a century period of time. And what's amazing is in the 1870 picture, you're seeing the Wollersheim Winery existing within a prairie landscape with exceptional trees located on the tops of the ridge or in the bottoms of the valley, but pretty much a prairie landscape. And I'll get to this rectangle here in a moment. But by 1910, 40 years later, we can see that that landscape is changing. Lots of trees that are located in the valleys, a lot more trees in the bottom part of the valley, and a lot more trees at the top of the hills, and cedars coming into the prairie areas. By 1993, so 83 years later, we see a forested landscape. That forested landscape exists not because people planted trees, not because of any kind of activity that people were trying to do on purpose, except that they stopped fire. So basically, in approximately a century, we went from a prairie landscape to a forested landscape by doing nothing or by actively suppressing fire. But in terms of management objectives, that can be considered doing nothing. That to me is an amazing sort of thing to think about. Every one of you, I imagine, understands that our environment has changed over your lifetimes. But what I think we often fail to grasp is just how dramatically that change has been. At the same time, and this might sound counterintuitive, we also can see the assemblage of what we can accomplish through restoration, which is this prairie landscape that exists within this rectangle exists in 1870 and then still is there in 1910 and importantly still is there in 1993 and it's still there now in 2026. That prairie landscape allows us to save the parts in order to do intelligent tinkering, as Leopold describes, by being able to begin restoration processes, which we're actually doing on Round Top Bluff, as well as many other areas in Wisconsin, in those state natural areas that Caitlin was talking about in her introduction. So two things are clearly obvious in this slide. One is that the change has been dramatic, and obviously influences lots of species that require those habitats that are changing. But also, in some cases, that change has not occurred yet and gives us an opportunity to have the luxury of thinking about restoration, of trying to put back or recover many of the species that we have lost. This slide illustrates the same thing. So basically in 1840, this whole hill, this whole bluff was prairie. And now, and this picture was taken in the 1990s, it's forested on the northern aspect, and you can still see snow existing on that hillside. It's prairie on the southern aspect. There's no snow because it's all melted off. It's much hotter. But by lack of fire, you can see that even though it's taking longer for that change to occur, the cedars are coming in that prairie and it eventually will go. So we do have an opportunity, but that opportunity is disappearing. Because of those large changes, the bottom line is that most every single species, a majority of the species that have some level of conservation concern, that are endangered, that are threatened, that are worrisome in decline in a worrisome manner, are declining in Wisconsin because one aspect or another of their life cycle is dependent upon fire. And with suppression, we start losing those species as these changes occur. So these changes are very relevant for the kinds of species that we and the Natural Resources Foundation and many other conservationists are seeking to uh, keep healthy, keep their populations healthy in a sustainable manner. And so fire is a key aspect of trying to accomplish that. So putting fire back on the ground is necessary if we want to protect species, if we want our native ecosystems to be healthy. Um, and it's interesting because it's a non-living thing it's the non-living glue that holds together all the living parts. So it's uh, a management tool that we can use. And interestingly, it's a management tool that has been used for millennia. Most of Wisconsin's landscapes basically were created or managed by indigenous peoples for millennia before European settlers came to our area. It's only after European settlement has occurred that many of the changes that we're talking about were initiated, and we had great perturbations in our ecological world. Thinking about how much fire do we need, if fire is important, if we answer the question that fire is critical to maintaining ecosystems and species and ecological services in our landscape, the next question then becomes where do we need it and how much do we need? The map on the left essentially maps out fire return intervals, meaning how frequently does fire occur in the landscape? And in this case, the red is more frequent fire and the green is less frequent fire. But I think what I want you to focus on primarily is this map on the right, which takes that fire return interval and also takes where remnants exist to prioritize the places that we need to look to put more fire onto the ground. And as you can see, and it probably isn't a surprise to you, in the central sands area, there are many remnants that are remaining that have a short fire return interval and they're very high priority. So is the lower Wisconsin River Valley that you can see mapped here, the Kettle Moraine area, the northeastern sands, and the northwestern sands. All of these are very important areas where fire not only is important, but where we think we have an opportunity to make a real difference in putting fire back onto the ground. How much fire? These models basically come up with an estimate that we need to be burning 1 million acres per year in Wisconsin. Right now, we are burning about 75,000 acres per year. So what this assessment is indicating is that we need to increase our capacity for prescribed burning by an order of magnitude. That is a tall order. If you think that's a foolish order because it is so big that it is absolutely impossible, we can learn more about this by what other people in the US are doing. So if you look, first of all, at Kansas and Oklahoma, they're burning over 1 million acres a year. Now, you might argue, well, Kansas and Oklahoma, it's pretty easy to burn 1 million acres a year because their burn units can be 1,000 or 2,000 acres in size. They're burning these big grassland areas. Their fire breaks are roads, so it's really easy to get that amount of burning done. And that's a fair argument to make. But what I find particularly fascinating is if you notice here in Georgia and in Florida, they're also burning 1 million acres a year. Those areas have higher human densities than do Kansas and Oklahoma. And they have much more complicated fuels. They have forested systems, they have wetland systems, they have grassland systems, they have pine systems. So it is a much more complicated landscape, and yet they're still able to burn 1 million acres a year. And one reason why they might be able to pull off burning 1 million acres a year is that Georgia and Florida never fully lost their culture of prescribed burning that originated with the Seminoles and other indigenous peoples in that area, and the Cherokee, for example, but they continued that burning well after European settlement dominated that landscape because many of the early Europeans that were there found it in their to their purpose because the pines that are there are particularly dependent upon fire, as are many of the species that people valued, such as bobwhite quail. And without fire management, bobwhite quail decline dramatically. So the cultures weren't lost in Georgia and Florida as they were, say, in the Midwest. But we, over the last 30 years, have worked quite hard to reestablish that culture and reestablish the tools of prescribed fire. And so we think that we have at least an opportunity to strive towards that 1 million acre a year mark. And it's with collaborations with organizations like the Natural Resources Foundation, for which we're quite grateful to be able to engage in that idea of building capacity. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, the other part of why burn is what are you really accomplishing? So ultimately, what fire is doing in that ecological landscape is it's increasing the productivity. And I won't geek out in terms of how that actually happens. So it's a pretty cool story. Um, but the bottom line is fire is improving our capacity to, improving the ability of that ecosystem to be productive. So it can produce more flowers. And if you produce more flowers, it leads to more seeds. And this is one good way of depicting it. So if you see the arrow in the upper right-hand corner of each of these two pictures, you can note that that's the exact same tree in the exact same position. The only difference between the two pictures that you see here are how the year that the picture was taken. So on the left, the picture was taken in the spring of, or in the early summer of 2008, actually in July of 2008, during the first growing season since we did a prescribed burn on this area. So basically, we did a prescribed burn in April, and this is a picture in July. Now, on the right is the exact same prairie restoration area, uh, but it's during the second growing season since the last burn. So the last burn was in 2008, and this is a picture in July of 2009. So you can see, for example, that compass plant is doing very well. Compass plant is still alive and it's still at the same frequency, but it's not flowering nearly as much. And even if you look at the plants that are flowering, there are not as many flowers per plant. So you get a feeling for what the productivity is. And this is just one growing season since, or two growing seasons since the last burn. So the effect of fire in stimulating the productivity of the prairie is dramatic. And then once you have those seeds, fire also is creating access by those seeds to bare mineral soil. And without bare mineral soil, those seeds will not um, succeed in their germination so that the roots that are forming after the seed germinates need to find mineral soil very quickly or else they'll dry out and they can't get the resources needed to continue growing. And so that combination of producing seeds through many flowers, but also falling on bare mineral soil is quite critical for our prairie systems. In the forest systems, what you can find here, this is not a photo point, though it kind of looks like one, but the basic gist when you are burning in forested systems that are fire adapted is you're basically changing from a shrubby middle story, which is dominant, and almost nothing in the understory, to having almost nothing in the middle story and a dominant understory. And so this understory is where much of the diversity of a forest system comes from, because of the wide array of species that grow here compared to the very narrow subset of species that grow in this middle story area. So, but to get this, this is not just a one-off year. You can change the structure very quickly, but it takes many years, 10 to 15 years to be able to get this kind of lush herbaceous understory. So fire isn't just a one-off management activity. It's something that has to continue over a longer period of time. Fire can change structure in grasses, even if they aren't native grasses, as my dog Bo is illustrating here. This is a cool season pasture. It's full of timothy and brome and quackgrass, all non-native grassland grass species. But our grassland birds, which are in decline, definitely respond well to these grasses as much as they do prairie grasses. And what you can see here is these cool season grasses in their first growing season following a burn. Now these ecologically function very different. So cool season grasses, especially those that are not native, don't like fire. And so in the first growing season since the last burn, um, on the left here are grasses that are stunted, and they're not liking that they just got burned, and so they're about 2 feet high and they're flowering much, much less. In the exact same pasture on this side, this is the second growing season since the last prescribed fire, and you can see the grasses are doing very well with a lot of flowering, and they're 3 times as high. So these are about 4 feet high, these are about 2 feet high. So you get the reverse sort of response. But if you're interested in managing grassland birds, bobolinks like this area. They don't like this area as much, but Henslow sparrows, they like this kind of area and don't like this area. So you can still, even if you're dealing with cool season pastures, you can still be using fire to manage for bird species. Another example of that is if you look at this forested edge area, the black arrows indicate the same trees and the white arrows this same tree, so you get an idea that it's a clear photo point. And from 2019 to 2023, we opened up that forest considerably with a combination of fire and removing non-native or non-fire adapted trees. And so fairly quickly, we altered the forest canopy, and what we got from that are red-headed woodpeckers, which are a species of oak savanna, and were declining for a long period of time until management started, and they've responded very well to management. And also rusty patch bumblebees, which are federally endangered, and they're also found in this landscape. We were able to move from this in 2019 to this in 2023 more quickly by using a combination or an integration of different management activities as opposed to using fire alone. And we probably would not even have gotten to this if we just tried to use non-fire management activities alone. So integrating management activities with fire is important. And just to give you an idea, those of you who have a gray hair quotient that's similar to me, um, let it be is a resonant term that has existed for quite some time in the environmental movement, um, and is a management activity. Obtaining land and doing and preventing development from occurring on it, but doing no other management activity is thought to be a very important management strategy. And I would disagree. This is a great example of let it be management. This is on a conservation land. This is publicly owned land on this side, and this is all buckthorn. And this ecosystem is now greatly reduced in its value because it's very simplified in that it's pretty much buckthorn and very few other species, but it's been followed with a let it be management activity. Whereas on this side, the private landowner has invested 25 years of restoration effort into this area, and it's got 100 times the number of species that are existing in this area, and is producing many ecological services. So just to give you an example of different management scenarios that can occur, including fire. Um, And part of this is that it is very difficult for any management to benefit all species. And just to try to illustrate this, and I know it's kind of a wonky way of doing it, but you've got, in this case, 25 species of insects that occur in the leafhopper family. But what's really cool is all of these were found in one summer within 10 meters of each other, in a prairie remnant. And these species, it's kind of, you can look at these species and say, well, how do you do a fire management plan that is perfect for all 25 species? And the reality is you can't. But what you can do is create the system where these species have evolved under and can be sustainable and that they'll persist over time. And that's the overall goal. And it's an important concept to keep in mind. And so we do that in place by having things like no burn refugia areas when we do a prescribed burn, so that in some of these areas, insect species don't decline because of the fire, but then are benefited on a long-term basis because we are burning areas that are adjacent to them. And so they do really well in here if they can colonize, going from the no burn area and colonizing areas that were recently burned. The final thing I want to kind of talk about is time. And time is incredibly important in these systems. And to illustrate that, my daughter is willing to be a guinea pig. So I germinated this compass plant 2 weeks before Annie was born. And so this is the compass plant flowering for the first time, and Annie is 7 years old. So they're both the same age. 18 years later, the compass plant is still there, and Annie is still there, fortunately, and of course, quite a bit older. Annie is going to be 34 this spring, and those plants, I presume, are going to be coming back up. They were up last year. So those plants, those exact same plants, are still there, and they're 34 years old. The point being is that these plants can be often very long-lived. And just to illustrate this for a wide number of species, not just one plant, I'll show you some photo points from a planting at the Crane Foundation that I did long ago in 1990. And the white arrow illustrates the same tree so that these are tightly controlled photo points. So after 4 growing seasons, this area was dominated by Indian grass, big blue stem, and Canada wild rye. And I thought, okay, this is what the prairie is going to look like forevermore. But by the ninth growing season, most of those tall native grass species were much less dominant. And what was dominant is this ochre colored grass that's of moderate elevation or moderate height, and that's little blue stem. Okay, so I thought maybe now we're done. This is going to be a little blue stem dominated prairie, and it just took longer for little blue stem to become dominant. But after 19 growing seasons, you can see this planting looks different again. And that is because most of this grass here is prairie dropseed, which forms hummocks. And the little blue stem is decreased in quantity as the prairie dropseed became very much more dominant in that area. So almost 20 years, this planting is still changing. But what's really interesting is we can show that the density of a prairie dropseed hasn't changed much over those 2 decades. It's just the amount of cover, the amount of dominance. So it just took time for that plant to become dominant. And you can see that after 32 years, change is still occurring, not nearly as much, but it is still occurring. The reason why I go into this is that what's happening in these prairie areas is that they're growing down, not up. And so much of the biomass that is occurring for these species is underneath the ground. So if you look, this is a scale in feet. So you can see root activity going down at least 8 feet into the soil. And some studies have shown up to 30 feet into the soil, many roots can go down if they're not blocked by things like bedrock. The reason why that is really important, and I'm not just geeking out, is that forms the basis of the longevity of these restoration activities, but importantly, the source for all the ecosystem services that come from things like prairie. This is what drives increased groundwater recharge. This is what filters our water to produce high quality water. This is where biological diversity comes from. This is where our aesthetic value comes from. All of these things are important and they're occurring on the same properties and they are stimulated by fire. Without them, they will eventually not persist and we will lose those ecological services. The reason again then why that is becomes important is that most land in the US is still privately owned. So we can't afford to work with landowners, which takes a considerable effort to say, okay, we're going to protect rusty patch bumblebees, or we're going to protect grassland birds, or we're going to protect game species like bobwhite quail. And then in 20 years succeed in our goal, but we didn't do anything to protect groundwater recharge. And so we have flooding as a problem, or we didn't store much carbon so that we have a lot more carbon that is still increasing in our atmosphere. Most of our ecological solutions are land based, and so they're going to come from the exact same properties that serve multiple purposes. And so dealing with that is absolutely essential. So, prescribe burning, you plan, you engage people, you monitor, and the bottom is what can happen. So, on this Bluff Prairie, for example, this is a fire break that we burned in, and we burned this side so that we can successfully do this sort of burning within ecological landscapes, and we can do it safely and effectively. How can you burn more? You can hire people to do it, but of course that costs money and it's a long-term effort, so it's money over many years. You can do it yourself, and that is quite possible to do. And what the Fire Council is really trying to do is train people to meet each of those needs so that we're training professionals, but we're also training landowners because the type of training for professionals and for landowners is fundamentally different. And so we are trying to do both. In addition to that, we're taking on a goal of trying to, not ourselves, but we're trying to form the partnerships necessary to get up to burning 500,000 acres per year by 2034. That's an audacious goal, but we think we can actually get there. We welcome you to become members of the Fire Council. The website, prescribedfire.org, is at the bottom of our logo. Um, and that membership is allowing us to pursue many different activities that basically surmount to trying to increase our capacity. Regardless of what you choose to do or whatever any of us do, all of us are in the same boat. We need to up our game wherever we live, however we can, and time really matters. If we delay or don't accomplish these objectives, more species will be lost. More ecological services will be lost. We can do that through more safe, effective fire, and that's our collective goal. It's time to engage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeb. That was so wonderful and um, informative. I really appreciate you sharing all of that. And I love the Wollersheim photo points. I hadn't seen those before. It's a great way to tell that story. Um, so, as was shared, please feel free to drop questions that you have in the Q&A part of the webinar, and we'll monitor those. But I know, Jeb, I've got a couple of questions for you to get us started. One is, and you mentioned, Wisconsin Prescribed Fire Council and looking for, folks to get involved with that. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Are you, is it a membership-based organization? Seeking donations? How can people find out about upcoming trainings? Can you just talk a little bit more about involvement with the Fire Council?
Absolutely. Thanks for the question, Caitlin. I'll pay you later for that one. The Fire Council is a nonprofit organization. We are a membership-driven organization, and we're a mixture of professionals and non-professionals. But we don't like to say non-professionals because that doesn't sound very good. But they're composed of landowners and other people who are interested in conservation for a variety of purposes. And fire is kind of a cool thing because in order to do it, you obviously do need to have training to do things effectively and safely, but we can mix people who don't have much training with people who do, and it becomes a really nice collaboration and mentorship that's occurring. And so people who are interested, let's say that you, Caitlin, are a landowner and you want to burn on your own property. Well, you can go to a training course that we do, which is a good start. But you can also be burning with us or with other people who are burning on land so that you can gain some of that experience and then apply it to your property. And the fire council will work with you to help you develop a burn plan and to develop to identify the conditions under which it's safe to do a prescribed fire given your level of ability on that. And ultimately, prescribed fire for everyone is all about staying within your level of experience and understanding. And that's how you are safe. And that's different for me. It's different for you. It's different for everybody who's on this call because we all have these different experiences. And so our training and our way of reaching out to either landowners or professionals is geared towards what their needs are, which of course are going to be as different as what we just described. So yes, you can join. You don't have to be a fire professional to join. We'll put you to work. I've got several burns that even as I look out my window, doesn't seem like it's going to be burnable weather, but I'm hoping that we'll be out burning on Sunday and Monday. So, and I burn with volunteers all the time, and many people do. So there's lots of ways of being involved.
Super, thank you. And maybe Marie, I can have you put the Prescribed Fire Council link in the chat while we're going through these questions.
And it's a real
Well,
easy link because it's prescribedfire.org. Go
I know
figure.
I'm always impressed you guys got that got that URL. Must have gotten in early. All right. Thanks for these questions in here in the chat. So it looks like a great question on how climate change has impacted the timing of the prescribed fire season.
Well, climate change is definitely impacting the timing of prescribed fire in that it's becoming more possible to get burns done in February. And then we have these funky things like people were doing prescribed fire last week. Now with 6 inches, 8 inches of snow on the ground, we won't do prescribed fire for um, uh, another week or so because it will take time for things to dry out. But so timing is dramatically affected by that to the degree to which climate change is affecting the weather patterns that we have. One of the things that I think is very interesting and needs to look at more is that climate change is likely affecting the overall pattern of prescribed fire, but not necessarily to the degree to which we think it might, in that um, continent wide, we know that there is this gradient. So in the adjacent to the Rocky Mountains, we have really dry areas, and we call them, semi-deserts. If you go further east, then you get short grass prairie, which is a requires very little water, but a little bit more than a semi-desert. If you go further east into the Dakotas, for example, you get mixed grass prairie, which needs a little bit more water. If you go further east into Minnesota and Wisconsin, you're in the tall grass prairie zone. And then if you go a little bit further east and north, you get into the oak savannas and then into the pines. So there's this big gradient that is based on moisture and temperature that's occurring in our continent. And climate change is likely going to shift those areas, but they're going to shift them perhaps in a little bit more predictable areas. Now, this is different from the timing of fire, which is sort of a separate thing, but that gives us at least an opportunity for species to facilitate the movement of species along that gradient as climate change is basically shifting where that occurs. And that has occurred to some extent. 1,000 years ago, prairies extended all the way to Superior, Duluth Superior, and the border now in Minnesota for prairies was out by Itasca, so close to the state border with North Dakota, or I'm not as familiar with what happened and where that was in Wisconsin during those time periods, but you get the drift of, those some of those changes have occurred and species were able to deal with that degree of change.
Super. Thank you. Let's see. Um, Here's a question that I know you talked a little bit about with the refugia, but how do we protect the critters from the fire? I'm sure that's something that you hear quite a bit from folks.
Well, it's a great question, and I kind of went through it quickly, but let me just kind of come back to the mantra is that there's no management tool on the face of the earth that benefits all species. You're always going to have losers, winners, and neutrals. So the real question is are you burning in such a way that allows the sustainable persistence of the species that are native to that particular environment? So within those confines, still, if you do prescribe, if you use fire as a management tool, or if you use grazing as a management tool, or as if you use mowing as a management tool, you will still harm some of those species. Now, the question is do you do it in a way that fits within the ecology of that species? And so insects, I think, are really pretty interesting in that you can have a high degree of mortality from fire of doing when you do a prescribed fire, but it's not 100%. It might be 80% of the individuals might be negatively impacted by that fire. They might be killed by that fire. But if you leave some areas unburned, insect adaptation to fire might not necessarily, for all species, be surviving the fire. They might be recolonizing after the fire. And so, of course, insects have a very high reproductive potential, as most farmers who are dealing with insect pests know, um, that if you can make sure that some of the species that are dependent upon that prairie system can survive any particular fire that you do, you allow them to then recolonize, and they're able to recolonize that because the productivity of the system is much greater for the insects as well as for the plants. And so that's the point of having those internal refugias is if you have some of those species that are isolated, you can increase the probability that they're going to persist in that area by making sure that you don't burn all of that particular habitat at any one time.
Thank you.
That
We've
for
got
birds, the story is a little bit different, but it's the same kind of idea is you don't want to burn all of your nest habitat at the same time, for example. Sorry.
right. We've got a couple of questions from folks, looks like private landowners who've been bringing fire onto their landscape. So here's one. We have about a 1 acre prairie that we have had burned a couple of times by a private consultant over the past 4 years. Is this 2 year frequency reasonable given we are paying ourselves, or is more or less frequent okay?
Well, it depends. What's missing from the question is how old is the prairie planting? So at the Crane Foundation, when I did the experiments that I illustrated with one set of slides, we burned for the first 5 growing seasons in a row because our goal wasn't to manage insects. Our goal was to establish the species of plants that we were establishing to the best of our ability. Um, and then once we wanted to get to a more maintenance phase, we would burn once every 3 years or so on and try to make that a little bit random so that, sometimes it might be four, sometimes it might be two, um, but basically on average 3 years. So that fire return interval changes depending on what your goals are.
And are these types of questions from landowners something that the Prescribed Fire Council can help with, or what would you recommend?
Absolutely. We're happy to try to address some of these questions, and that's one of the reasons why we're building our capacities so that we have the means to be able to effectively reach out when landowners have questions like that. But also, one of the things that I think is really to illustrate, um, I can I've literally I've worked with potato growers for 30 years to create a whole farm standard. And part of that includes doing prescribed burns and prairie restorations on their farms. And I've taught prescribed fire to uh, potato farmers, and I can teach them what they need to know in 2 days. Now, that's not normal for the amount of time that it takes you to be a fire boss. But when I say, okay, you can go burn these prairie plantings that you're doing after 2 days of training, I'm giving them very precise prescriptions for the weather under which they can burn and the kind of area and the kinds of fuels that they can burn in. So it's a very narrow circumstance under which they have the training to burn that safely. And that's very much what I mean is that everybody burning burns within a certain set of constraints. I've done almost 1,000 burns in my life, but I'm still constrained by lots of things that I don't have experience with. And it's important that I understand that so that I avoid burning outside of that window because then all of a sudden I can make mistakes that are dangerous. And it's the same thing with the potato farmers that I work with, in that we give them very narrow prescriptions under which they can burn, but they can, if they follow that, they can burn safely and effectively with a relatively small amount of training. So that's the kind of interaction that the Fire Council, anticipate with private landowners so that we can basically give them on-the-job training as they expand their experience in order to accomplish their objectives. Because if we don't do that, there's no way we're going to burn 1 million acres a year. Most of that's going to come from private landowners.
All right. We've got another property specific question. I have a 32-year-old prairie, 3 acres, which is burned every year or two. It has too much Indian grass, which is overtaking the little blue stem and side oats. How can I control the excessive Indian grass?
Um, well, controlling the Indian grass in place, it's a little hard to address that question without knowing the density of other species that you've got growing there. And so I can't answer your question directly, but I'll try to answer it indirectly. Um, at the Crane Foundation, in the experiment that I illustrated in one plot, I actually did 6 different plots. And in those, Indian grass established itself at varying levels of density. But in no case, even though we burned the first 5 growing seasons and we burned fairly intensively thereafter, in no case did Indian grass become dominant. And in part, my hypothesis for that is that because we had lots of other species that were competing with that Indian grass quite readily. What often happens in prairie restorations is that they'll be heavy on grasses overall, fairly light on forbs, and aren't planted in such a way that you'll have good success of the few seeds that you put in there for forbs. And so you basically have a heavily grass dominated system. And then if you burn, Indian grass can easily kind of take over that area. Um, so it's not necessarily that Indian grass is terribly invasive, but you've set up the circumstances where a few species will become highly dominant in a particular area. So in the particular case where they currently have too much Indian grass, um, if they can try to establish specific areas where they can carve out to get more forbs established, is going to help them. But they're going to have to do it where they've got enough individuals of, say, sky blue aster or things or baptisia. What's baptisia? Indigo, in their area so that those plants can get established and begin competing better with the Indian grass.
Right. I know there was a question, partially which I think we answered for NRF, but there was a question about internships or opportunities for recent graduates to get involved and get some experience this fall. Does the Prescribed Fire Council offer any internships or have a resource to direct folks to that?
Well, so you're right, Natural Resources Foundation and the International Crane Foundation and lots of conservation groups do offer internships. And so I think that there's a great opportunity to go and apply in those areas. The Fire Council doesn't have internships per se, but many of us do burn with volunteers. And so if you want to get experience, you can either take training courses and or you can volunteer with prescribed burns to build that experience level, which then allows you to have an application that people will pay more attention to because you have skills that they're looking for.
That's great. Yep, and I know there's groups like the Prairie Partners and lots of great resources. So feel free to email. I know we just put it in the Prescribed Fire Council email into the chat as well for some of the questions. I know we're not going to have. We got a minute left, so I know I have one question I want to wrap us up with. But if folks can reach out directly to that email address to follow up. But just to end us, Jeb, aside from joining the Prescribed Fire Council, what are some of your big takeaways for how the public can help bring more fire to Wisconsin?
Well, I think anyone can help us get more fire on the ground safely and effectively. Private landowners can think about if they want to get fire done on their land. I will almost guarantee that they have a fire adapted landscape that's still on their property. No, maybe not great, but it's there. Um, and the question is how? So you can hire a contractor to do things. You can try to take training courses on your own and then begin to learn how to do prescribed fires on your own, starting small and building gradually. And if you're young in it, or if you don't own land, young or old, you can still be engaging with people who are doing prescribed fire to help them get more fire on the ground that way. And so the Prairie Enthusiast works with volunteers. I work with volunteers. Other organizations, Ice Age Trail works with volunteers. So lots of folks will be willing to give people an opportunity. And so we can all be engaged with getting more fire on the ground safely and effectively. Um, if you can donate to Natural Resources Foundation or the Fire Council, if that's a way that you can try to get more fire on the ground, because of course, all of this is people dependent and people ultimately need to have food on the table. And so therefore they need to get paid. And so there's lots of ways that people can engage.
Yeah. And probably just raising awareness too, since there's still a lot of, of folks who don't realize how important fire is. So spreading the word.
It's always going to be important to spread the word and to raise awareness. But one of the things that that I think is important to keep in mind is, almost 40 years ago when Barb and I moved to this area, we thought when we started to see these prairie remnants disappearing, we thought, oh, if we can just provide people with a land ethic, if we can just teach them of the value of these prairies, um, everything will be okay. And what we found when we started reaching out to our neighbors is we found that they actually already valued the prairie and actually already understood that fire was needed. But what they didn't have is the way to engage with fire. They didn't have the tools. And so I would argue that we actually have done a really nice job with environmental education, much more than we ever expected, in that we've got a huge portion of our society out there who already gets it. They have a land ethic. But what we haven't done is we haven't kept pace with that environmental education to provide them with the tools to then act on that land ethic that they already have. Now, of course, there's always people that reaching out is always going to be a good thing. So it's not that that's bad, but that I think we're out of balance because we haven't done what we need to do sufficiently to provide people with the tools so that they can really act on that land ethic.
Very well put, Jeb. All right, folks, thank you so much for joining us. There's the email address if you have further follow-up questions for Jeb and the team at the Prescribed Fire Council. That's info@prescribedfire.org. We'll also be emailing out the recording of this webinar if you want to tune back in. Jeb, a huge thanks to you for sharing your knowledge and answering all these thoughtful questions and just being such a huge supporter of prescribed fire here in Wisconsin.
You're more than welcome. Thanks to the Natural Resources Foundation for helping move conservation forward, right? It's a good
Right.
partnership.
Team effort. Thanks, everyone. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day and hope to see you on one of our field trips or webinars later this year.